joining us today for the November meeting of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. And I'm going to share my screen, and I have a few things that I want to share with everybody. And then I'll just double check, Mark, since you're running things, does everything look good? You're seeing the main slide that I put up with our website and so forth.
Yeah, I see your main slide up there. Everything looks good so far.
Right. Zoom is great, but when you're sharing a screen, and most of you probably know this, you don't actually see what the other people see. So you always want to make sure that it's working the way you expect. So we are a 501c3 organization that works to bring passenger rail service to our area, and we just have some information here. We normally have a meeting on the third Thursday most months at 8 a.m. We've been doing it via Zoom, not only because of the current situation, but because we're spread across a pretty wide geographical area, and this is a practical way to share things with people. If you're not already a member, I'd encourage you to go to our website and click the join button. And then coming up, our next meeting would be on Thursday, December 16th. And then we do have an annual meeting where we elect our directors, and that is on Thursday, January 20th. The business meeting, I'm sure, will be short, and we'll have some kind of presentation there as well. So just a few reminders about who we are. Our mission is to provide leadership and coordination to develop passenger rail service through West Central Wisconsin as part of a regional strategy to ensure a balanced transportation system for long-term sustainable economic growth. And I mentioned Mark's name. I've been a little bit remiss in introducing myself as well as Mark. Mark is our Secretary Treasurer and our overall Zoom and technical and website guru. So we appreciate all the work Mark does to help make things happen for us. And I am Scott Rogers. I'm currently the chair of the board of directors. This is the area we're generally talking about, which is primarily the corridor in Wisconsin between Eau Claire and Chippewa counties and the St. Croix River into Minnesota, and interested in reaching both directions, but initially working on things to the Twin Cities. And our vision is to attract and retain talent to our area through enhanced connectivity. And we have supporters like Royal Credit Union who have indicated from a business perspective how important it is to have passenger rail service. As we look at some of our long-term objectives, this is a map from the current state rail plan for Wisconsin, which shows future service through Eau Claire and our entire corridor, as well as the Minnesota State Rail Plan, which shows St. Paul to Eau Claire as one of their phase one services. And then as we look at methods to get passenger rail service to our area, and we've talked about this before, we have looked around to see what has been successful around the country or initiatives that are innovative that might be able to be emulated here. So things like public-private partnerships, or even all private operations like Brightline in South Florida, where the economic activity around the stations is a big part of what's making the service work. An example of that just here in the Midwest, Normal, Illinois, which is a mid-sized Illinois city with multi-train frequencies and a state university, has seen tremendous growth when they developed their passenger rail station. And then we've seen that things like passenger rail authorities, joint power authorities, and commissions have been an important part of local management or bringing about new passenger rail service. So we've looked at those things and how they could be applied in our region. So what I'm going to do today is give basically an update on a couple things. We did not have a meeting in October. We had a lot of things our board of directors was working on, and also I attended the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission meeting in Detroit, and that conflicted with having our meeting. And so I do want to give you a report on that and some of the things I learned there that I think are important to us. And then if you've noticed that on Monday, the president signed the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which includes significant investment in passenger rail. And we've been hearing about this for quite a while, particularly through the negotiations in the spring, the Senate passing it in the summer, and then the House finally passing it last week. And we've looked before at what's in it, but it is now law, and it's going to be an important aspect for the development of passenger rail service. So we want to look at that today. I'll give some brief updates on other things, and then at our December meeting is when we'll really follow up and talk about more specifics about the direction of our efforts here in West Central Wisconsin. And we do have a chat feature. So I think do we have that on, Mark? If we have any questions, we can try to answer those as we go along or at the end.
Yeah, so the chat feature is on, and I can monitor that.
And if I miss anything, call my attention to it. I'll try to watch for that, or we'll primarily do that towards the end. So the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, which is a little bit of a mouthful, is an 8-state organization. It was actually formed by legislation in each of those states that mirrors each other and creates a commission. They have hired this Council of State Governments to operate the commission, and then each state has up to 4 commissioners that are appointed to serve on the commission. It's the successor to the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative. And if you've not heard of that, that was really the effort that was started in the 1990s, and Wisconsin and Governor Thompson at that time were among the leadership of that to try to develop a rail network in the Midwest. And it really had some important foresight to say we're going to need passenger rail service in the future and move towards a network. And in fact, that was a little bit of the impetus of starting the Rail Coalition, because the initial map for the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative did not include service to West Central Wisconsin, simply a bus connection to Toma. And some of the leaders that founded this organization really started working with Wisconsin DOT and Minnesota to say, what is the potential here, and what can we do to be part of the planning? So the commission meets annually, and I have, since 2019, I was actually appointed by Governor Evers, as the private sector representative. Ron Rao from the Wisconsin DOT is also an appointed member. In fact, he's the vice chair of the commission. The current chair of the commission is Bob Guy, who is the state director for SMART Transportation, which is a significant union in transportation. He's from Illinois. And Sharon Nagel is the treasurer, and she's actually a Republican state legislator from Indiana. And one of the interesting things about MIPRC is that it is very bipartisan, and it actually covers a wide variety of states. So you have states like Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, as well as Missouri, who have state-supported services. And then you have states like North Dakota and Kansas, who are very dependent upon their long-distance services. And it's really an interesting group to be part of, and to get updates and learn and interact with Amtrak and FRA and others in planning for passenger rail service for the Midwest. This is actually a picture of the commissioners in Chicago. What actually happened was we met initially at Chicago Union Station, and then took the train to Detroit, and the rest of our meetings were in Detroit. So you can see our commissioners here. I kind of joke that we're standing in front of a picture of the next generation of Siemens locomotives for future passenger rail. But if you recognize that, it's actually a room called the Pennsylvania Room, and that's a streamlined steam locomotive from quite a number of years ago in Union Station, but a very nice part of their Metropolitan Lounge there at Union Station. And one of the reasons for meeting at Chicago not only was to experience a corridor train, but the Federal Railroad Administration unveiled the Midwest FRA Midwest Corridor Study, which has been long in the making, and we've been kind of anxiously awaiting the results of that. The picture you see here is at Chicago Union Station at the press conference. That's Amit Bose, who is the acting administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration. He's awaiting Senate confirmation, but he made the announcement of the release of this study. And I'll talk about what that includes in just a minute. But we started with that, and then we took the afternoon Wolverine train to Michigan. And Amtrak put a special car on the last, as the last car on the train, which you can see is looking out the back as an observation type car. They hosted us there. I had a speedometer app on my my phone, and you can see that we were indeed doing 110 miles an hour during much of the trip. Michigan owns some of the track. Amtrak owns some of the track. Norfolk Southern owns some of the track, but they've been working to upgrade that service, although they still only have 3 trains a day, which limits its usefulness somewhat. And some of that has to do with congestion around Chicago. And then you can see a picture. We had some presentations on the train. Some of you may know Derek James from Amtrak. He's the one in the kind of brownish coat talking to the group that I have the photo of there. We arrived in Detroit. You can see there what has become somewhat of an outdated station, although it is right next to Woodward Avenue, where Michigan, or the Detroit, has created the Q Line streetcar, which is a free streetcar that runs up and down Woodward Avenue. And we had a chance to experience a little bit of the improvements in Detroit. Detroit is kind of moving back up, and with the streetcar investment in Woodward Avenue, you can see that their downtown, as I understand it, has improved a lot over what it was a few years ago. They've also moved all of their sports stadiums downtown, which has created additional activity. So the commission met for a couple days in Detroit. And what I'm showing you here is a little bit of information showing some of the commissioners and where we were meeting. And what you're seeing here is Peter Schwartz from the Federal Railroad Administration giving a presentation about the FRA regional study. One of the things that is worth mentioning is, anytime you have a conference like this and you have a chance to get a group like this together, when you have dinner together, when you have these presentations, when you're able to talk through issues, it does really help a lot in terms of coordination among the states and learning about the future of passenger rail service. So one of the things that was an advantage, I think, to us was I actually rode in on the Empire Builder the day before we went to Detroit. And Dan Chrome from Minnesota DOT was on the train. And then Arun Rao from WSDOT got on in Columbus. And we all rode into Chicago. And then, of course, during the event itself, we had a chance to talk about things and talk about our issues, et cetera. So that's a little bit about that. But I do want to give you just a couple things about the Midwest Regional Rail Planning Study. This has been long in the making. It's a very high-level study. Dave Christensen and Ann Schell and I had a chance to meet with Peter Schwartz here in Eau Claire, and I think it was 3 or maybe 4 years ago. So it's been a while getting the study done. Its release has been long awaited. A few important things to point out. This is from their slides. This is really intended to be a long-term vision, conceptual planning, and looking at overall importance of a connected network and corridors. One of the things that they strongly emphasized is, other than saying that certain cities and certain overall corridors need to be served, this was not a study that was intended to say, well, the route should go through these particular cities or pick this particular line. So I'm going to show you the map that that they showed to us. And basically the colored lines are the key lines that are part of the network. The dotted lines are lines that add to the network, are sort of standalone, are important to it. But they're basically saying that if we're going to build out a Midwest network, we need to for sure include these color lines. And then they have some definitions, which I won't take a long time to get into, but Core Express is sort of the highest level of service. It's an area where they say, as these corridors developed, Core Express would be true high-speed rail, say 200 miles an hour. Regional or Core Express would be routes where it might be something, the Northeast Corridor is actually considered sort of a regional type line because it is over 100 miles an hour, but it does share track with freight and uses existing rail lines. So they have other lines they've identified that might be that type or true high speed, and then others that are emerging that can be valuable rail lines, but share right of way with freight railroads and maybe not be over 100 miles an hour, but still contribute to the system. I think what's important here is that it would appear that Chicago to the Twin Cities through Milwaukee and Madison is one of the highest potential corridors identified through this study. So what they've talked about as far as next steps on it is they're really handing this off then and saying you need to start looking at the specific corridors. They did say there is additional work that needs to be done as far as getting in and out of Chicago because of congestion. And then if you have a significant increase in passenger rail traffic, how do you plan for stations in Chicago? What can Chicago Union Station happen? Then the prioritization would go to the regions. How do you do the governance for project development? And this is kind of where it gets handed off to organizations like MIPRC to really take it and run with it and do things regionally. And then it was referred to that, and this was before the infrastructure bill had been passed, but widely expected and with a lot of knowledge is what is in it, that there, I'll talk about it in just a minute, but there is a provision in the new infrastructure bill for organizations like MIPRC to have a role in corridor development. And then there's a corridor identification and development program that's part of the new infrastructure bill that I'll touch on in just a minute. I'm going to shift a little bit because now that we are talking about the infrastructure bill, I have a few visuals here from a webinar I attended just yesterday that was put on by the Rail Passengers Association, the national group. And I know that Mark is actually one of their council members. And they yesterday had Devon Barnhart, who is with One Rail. One Rail is a organization that represents the entire rail industry, everything from transit to freight railroads. And she gave a presentation on kind of what's in the bill and some high level information about it. And they'll share some more specifics too. But if you found it complicated following Washington and what's happening with different kinds of bills there, this clears it up at least a little bit. If you've been hearing about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and you've been hearing about the reconciliation bill or the social infrastructure bill, this gives a little bit of information about where we stand with those. The bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed with bipartisan votes in both houses of Congress. In fact, it was largely written in the Senate with a number of senators from both sides of the aisle, including prominent Republicans, being involved in putting the numbers together. It is now law, so it is in effect. It's a federal statute now, and it covers what we might consider hard infrastructure, traditional infrastructure. So it's broadband, water, ports, highways, electricity, rail, and other things like that. The bill that's still being negotiated and discussed and is potentially larger is what they call social infrastructure. It gets into some of these other things like pre-K. There is some transit and high-speed rail in the current draft of that. Most of the bill are other things like climate change and housing, child tax credits, things like that. That has not at this point passed either house of Congress, so the negotiations continue on that. So going to the infrastructure bill that is now law, there's about one of the things that's important to know about it is it's actually a couple things wrapped together. So it's $550 billion in new spending that includes over half of that for transportation. It also does something, it is the reauthorization of the surface transportation legislation. If you've heard of the FAST Act, that was expiring last year, they extended for a year. That's the surface transportation authorization that sort of sets a 5+ year framework for how the federal government addresses transportation. That had to be reauthorized. That's the one that has the policy in it. The new infrastructure spending is primarily spending, and these were actually wrapped together. So the bill that was passed was both some new spending that is totally separate, not totally separate, but is separate, and then reauthorization of the FAST Act. And this graphic really helps illustrate it quite a bit. So on the left, you see the FAST Act, and if you can see those colors, of course, we know that highways get the lion's share of our transportation spending in this country, and transit, you can see, is the somewhat medium shade of blue, and rail is the darker shade of blue. So the FAST Act actually had more rail than ever before, and that's the graph on the far left, the bar on the far left. The middle, the House had actually passed a surface transportation bill that really had the funding levels you see in that middle chart. That did not become law, but one of the things that One Rail did show us is that the one on the far right is the one that was passed by the Senate. And particularly if you compare that one to the FAST Act, you can see that it makes significant changes and increases in transit, and especially rail, over what we've ever seen before. And in fact, Devon Barnhart, during that presentation, said, this didn't include everything we wanted, but she said it's clearly transformational. So we're going to see a lot of changes there. Now, a lot of this stuff is hard to keep track of, so and hard to sort out. So I'm going to try to cover some overall policy implications of it and what's in it. This is going back to a chart that we saw at MIPRC, but it is what was in there. There is $66 billion in rail funding, and actually I'm not sure this slide is quite right because that does include freight rail. But there is some dedicated funding for the Northeast Corridor. There's some multi-purpose funding for various programs that already exist. CRISI is one of the programs that Wisconsin is taking advantage of for things like the second train and other improvements to the Hiawatha. The Railroad Grade Crossing Elimination Program is a new program. It's not, there is a railroad safety grade crossing program, but that's a brand new program that's additional dollars. And then there are some grants to Amtrak, $16 billion for its national network, which is things outside the Northeast Corridor. And then there's something called the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail. That initially was only a Northeast Corridor program up till now, and that's been opened up to the rest of the country, as well as to other things that could be used. So I'm going to go now to some information from Rail Passengers Association of some of the specifics that are in the bill. I don't expect you to maybe read or remember this or understand this chart, but this kind of goes to the fact that there's two things in here. There's the Surface Transportation Investment Act. That's the extension of the FAST Act, or the new version of the FAST Act. That has, for each of the next 5 fiscal years, different kinds of authorized funding levels. And then there's the bipartisan infrastructure deal. And you can see some of these things appear in both places. So this is where it gets complicated. One of the things that was pointed out to us as important is the part of the funding. So the way Congress works is they'll have a 5-year authorization, and then every year there is the discussion over the budget and appropriations, and do they actually appropriate the money that they authorize. An important part, if I'm understanding it correctly, and somebody perhaps can correct me if I have it wrong, part of this bill, and it's the bipartisan infrastructure deal portion of the bill, those are advance appropriations. Those are guaranteed appropriations that are not going to be subject to each year's Congress as to how much they're going to put into those programs. So if I'm understanding it right, the top section here are various kinds of programs that may be subject to, and I may even have that backwards. So I need to, but I will tell you that a significant part of this bill does include appropriations that are guaranteed for the next 5 years. So I want to go into what some of these things are, and I don't expect you to read all this, but just at a high level, part of what Amtrak is receiving is $16 billion for their national network. That's for things like acquiring new passenger rolling stock to replace obsolete equipment, upgrading stations that need it for the American Disabilities Act. It also requires US DOT to provide to Congress a plan to spend the first year's money within 180 days of an enactment. So they basically have 6 months to get that done. And then they do set aside $50 million for restoration and enhancement grants each year for restoring discontinued or starting new passenger rail service. And I'll come to that later because that's an important part of it. There's also $6 billion for various projects in the Northeast corridor. I'll leave that up for just a minute. And then it does include the federal state partnership for intercity passenger rail grants, $36 billion. At least $12 billion of that needs to go to projects that are not on the Northeast corridor. And the information I'm showing you here today is on the RPA website. It's railpassengers.org if you want to get into the detail. But the other thing I mentioned is that this bill is also the policy bill. It says here's how we're going to do our federal programs. And there's several important things that the passenger rail community feels are very positive in here. Among them are updating Amtrak's mission and goals to make it clear that their mission is to serve communities and maximize the benefits of federal investment. We've had some Amtrak managements in the past who have primarily been focused on the railroad's bottom line only and not really been paying attention to how well they serve communities. There's also an effort to ensure representation on the Amtrak's board from throughout the country and different constituencies. There's some language about station agents, requiring agents to be in certain kinds of stations with certain levels of activity, and then increased oversight of changes to routes and intercity services that Amtrak may make. There's an improved oversight of Amtrak spending, requiring more level of detail in its reports to Congress. And then one that is important is the passenger experience. Not all of you perhaps are travelers on Amtrak trains, but you know that, or even before COVID, Amtrak had really downgraded the quality of the service on some of their routes, particularly at the long distance services as far as the food availability. Some of that stemmed from a number of years ago. An anti-Amtrak congressman from Florida managed to get into law a requirement that its food services had to at least break even though that doesn't happen with airlines or anybody else, and it's part of the overall ticket. That section is repealed in this, and then there is also a requirement to have a working group, including representatives of passenger rail passengers, to improve Amtrak's onboard services. There's provisions about protecting service through rural communities, and then a couple other things that are significant. The one you see here that's a state-supported route committee. There is a state Amtrak intercity passenger rail committee that works on the state-supported services. As you may know, Wisconsin has the Hiawatha service from Milwaukee to Chicago and the soon-to-be TCMC between the Twin Cities and Chicago. And there has been a lot of concern among the states over Amtrak's cost allocation methodologies and accountability to the states and how it allocates out funds. And there is a section here that's going to be require this to be updated and be more transparent. And I think the states see that as very significant. They want to enhance cross-border service. And then there is going to be a study of Amtrak still has two trains that only run 3 days a week. And then there are other trains like the Pioneer through Idaho, the former North Coast Hiawatha through southern Montana, which the Big Sky Rail Authority is working on, where they would like to have that service back. And there's a mandate in here to do some studies to look at those. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but the Restoration and Enhancement Grant is a program that has been broadened as well as enhanced. And that could be a very important aspect for our effort to start new service here. Interstate Rail Compacts provides a grant program to provide funding and some advantages to rail compacts. So MIPRC would be well positioned to be part of that. And then the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail. That's one of their grant programs. It expands the eligibility to entities other than Amtrak and states. So some of the private organizations that have been working on passenger rail development would be eligible for those as well. And then finally, there's a corridor identification and development program. I'm going to touch on the Amtrak Connects Us plan in just a minute. But one of the aspects of this bill is to say, okay, now that we've created these programs and funding for passenger rail development, FRA is going to be charged with coming up with a process for identifying those corridors, which ones would be selected for development. And then, of course, that would be a significant part of how those funds are allocated and who becomes eligible to start new corridors. Given what the state of Wisconsin has already done, I think we're in very good shape to be moving in that direction and be part of that, but that'll be something we'll want to keep track of. I did want to touch on the restoration enhancement grants. So this is a grant that Wisconsin received for the TCMC startup. The funding in it was very limited in the past. It was something like $5 million a year. Now it's going to be $50 million a year over 5 years. It used to be 3 years of declining operating support. It has now been increased in year 1, and it's now 6 years. So it gives a state or an entity that's getting a new service started a longer period of time to get a service off the ground and have some federal operating support while they build ridership and revenues. So the other thing I wanted to touch on that we heard about from Amtrak at the MIPRC meeting was their vision. So the way you need to look at this, you've probably seen news stories, and in fact here locally, because our corridor was included, that Amtrak has this vision of services they want to start. And the way to look at this is that what we've just talked about is the infrastructure bill. It has these funding programs. It has this corridor identification program. And what Amtrak did was take some initiative and say, okay, if this moves forward, if we, and in fact, it's somewhat of a bid by Amtrak to say, we'd like to operate these services. They put out a map saying, okay, if this program goes forward and we're part of it, here's our vision of some of the things that we think would make sense. And so this is, if you Google Amtrak Connects Us, they actually have a website with maps on it. This is the map of the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor, and they have identified some service through Madison and some service through Eau Claire, Menominee, and Hudson as being something that they envision being implemented if their vision went forward. And they're talking about the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor, including some services through La Crosse and other services through Eau Claire and West Central Wisconsin. So that kind of takes us back to where we are and where we go from here, and some of the updates on what we're doing. And then I'll be ready to take some questions, and we can go back to some of these if you have any. But again, we are looking at kind of every strategy that can bring passenger rail service to our area. I mentioned earlier that we're interested in how commissions work, how development around stations can be advantageous to us. We have some information that the West Central Regional Planning has given us as far as how we could do some of that. And then importantly, we've had 6 municipalities and 3 counties come together and say, we are willing to form a commission to look at coordinating these efforts, possibly becoming a sponsor of services, working with Minnesota and counties on the other side of the river, as well as WSDOT, FRA, and others, if it's Amtrak perhaps, and any private organizations to say, how can we implement this to our region and how can we make that work? The status of that is we've had some initial meetings on organization. One of the challenges has been to get something like this off the ground with this kind of representation, with a few things up in the air like the Infrastructure Act, and then the difficulties of meeting strictly remotely. And so our current thought with that is that we are looking at we hope to have an in-person meeting of that commission early in the year to really pick up the ball, work on bylaws and some of the organizational details, and then roll up our sleeves and start working on what happens next with passenger rail development. And then I have one more thing to really update you on, and that is an effort that will bring service to us hopefully sooner rather than later, and at least in terms of a connection to existing Amtrak routes. This is a map from WSDOT of the TCMC service. That's the Chicago to Milwaukee to Twin Cities service that is now moving forward, been fully funded. They're in the process of doing final design. And then right now they're talking about 2024 for an implementation date. And that would be the second train on the Twin Cities to Chicago route that currently has the Empire Builder. And as part of that implementation, looking at, like they do in California and other places, having dedicated shuttle services from that route to serve places like La Crosse, Eau Claire, and Madison. In fact, at one of our meetings like this earlier this year, when we had Arun Rao from WSDOT, he gave us just sort of an idea of an illustration of if we were to implement this, when the Empire Builder is running and this TCMC train under its current anticipated schedule, this is what, if we started, if in fact we were able to start it in Menominee, some of the stops that you would see, and you could have twice a day where you could get to Milwaukee and Chicago on an Amtrak ticket from Eau Claire and Menominee. And so I've had some discussions with Arun. We'll talk about this later, or as we go into the next few weeks, as to how we could get this going, and perhaps to get it going before the TCMC and get a shuttle created to the Empire Builder service, and possibly by doing it like having the shuttle also go to the VA hospital in Toma, which could be another use and another way to get some ridership and get it started. So TCMC is something we'll be watching, and that's an exciting project that's moving forward as well. I showed you this map earlier. This is the current state rail plan. WSDOT is currently working on a new state rail plan, or an update to that one. When we heard from Arun at MIPRC and talking to him subsequently, they were looking at having some information out on some early draft of that in early 2022. So we'll have a chance to respond to that. They've indicated they're going to do a little bit of fairly high level ridership analysis for the different routes in the plan too, which will be helpful. So we'll keep an eye on that. And then finally, I did want to mention, I talked about One Rail earlier that gave the presentation to RPA yesterday, and they just released a national public opinion survey, and a couple of findings that were kind of interesting in that. They found that 83% of Americans believe we should shift more trips to public transit, passenger rail, and freight rail to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they also found that 7 out of 10 Americans view public transit and passenger rail favorably after the pandemic, and so that they are interested in and anxious to use those services going forward. So I'll just remind you that our next meeting will be on Thursday, December 16th. We'll also have our annual meeting in January. And here's access to our Facebook, email address, website, and Twitter. So I'm going to stop sharing and just see if anybody has any questions. I know I went through things kind of fast, but it's interesting how much is happening these days. And I don't think I see anything in the chat, or we can have a shorter meeting. I know I went through a lot of stuff. Anybody have any questions?
Scott, this is Mark. One question I had: when you attended the MIPRC conference in Detroit, does MIPRC, as far as the governing body, do they have kind of a master plan as to certain goals or things they would like to accomplish on a yearly basis, or something laid out? I was just kind of curious as to what kind of a work plan they have laid out in the next 2 to 3 years. Yes.
And that would be one of the last things that we did at that meeting, was look at some goals coming up. And we updated those because the last 2 meetings we had really related to trying to get this legislation that we just saw passed. So 2 years ago, we actually met in Washington, D.C. because we had anticipated the FAST Act expiring in 2021. And Of course, that ended up getting extended. So we actually had meetings on Capitol Hill. So last year and this year, the emphasis was getting some of the things done in legislation that we ultimately did. There were some things that we didn't get, we were disappointed in. Some of you that follow this may know that currently the law requires any route under 750 miles to be state supported. We tried to get that reduced to 250 miles or even 500. That has not happened, although there are some advantages to the new legislation because there are things like the restoration enhancement grants and other programs that will help with that and help reduce costs. So going forward, Mark, among them is to ensure that the organization is positioned for the new provisions in the legislation on interstate compacts, so that MIPRC could play a role in the development and identification of corridors and possibly for funding, et cetera. So there are some others, but that's the primary one that I recall. And to some extent, that legislation was drafted with organizations like MIPRC in mind. And it is worth noting that MIPRC and the Southern Rail Commission, which is the corridor between New Orleans and Mobile, really are probably the two organizations right now that are established and operating that probably already are closely qualify for that program. There are some other regional groups, but they're not as organized as much as MIPRC has been so far. Not that MIPRC is ready to just take off, but that would be one of the main goals coming up this year. Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Scott, I'd just like to inform the group of two activities I've involved in. Thanks to Scott's forwarding an invitation, I'll be speaking tonight via Zoom to the Iowa Passenger Rail Coalition, located in Dubuque, Iowa. They were state-sponsored by Iowa DOT up until 5 years ago, but they are still continuing as a public outreach group, grassroots group supporting passenger rail from the Mississippi River into Iowa. They also support Illinois' efforts to extend service to Rockford and to the river cities, particularly the Quad Cities there in Dubuque. And so I was going to ask you, Scott, if you could forward me this PowerPoint that you presented today to me.
Sure can.
Use some of it tonight. The other point of interest is that with the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission, which has now had interest shown by every city and county in Wisconsin to be involved in that commission, we've always had long-standing support with the city of St. Paul and Ramsey County, the home of St. Paul Union Depot, for our efforts on the corridor. But we have not had any outreach with Washington County, which is one of the intermediate counties. A station stop in Stillwater or Oak Park Heights or Lake Elmo would be part of their county commission. Thanks to several friends of rail in Ramsey County and Washington County, particularly Phil Brennan and Mike Coos, we have garnered an invitation from Commissioner Lisa Week from the Washington County Commissioners to make a presentation to them probably next month in December. In fact, I'll be talking to the manager of planning, Lisa Leitner over there today to set up that meeting. So, and the purpose of that is to reintroduce the coalition to them, introduce the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission, and ask for their support. So.
All right, thanks, Dave. Appreciate those activities going forward. Yeah, I'll get you an email shortly after we're done here today.
This is Mark. I had a question for you, Dave. As you know, most everyone here, I'm involved with Allboard Minnesota, and Allboard Minnesota recently learned that Washington County in Minnesota and Dakota County, Minnesota had withdrawn from the Great River Rail Commission. And that sort of surprised us. And I know one thing at Allboard Minnesota, we're going to try to work to see if we can get them to get back in the the Great River Rail Commission. I don't know if you've had any update or input on or insight on that, Dave, or not.
Yeah, the St. Cloud and Stearns County people are more concerned about developing commuter rail from Minneapolis. And they don't see, now that TCMC is moving ahead and is funded, that they have an ongoing interest in that particular group. They believe the focus has shifted away from them. Washington County only reinstituted their membership in the Great River Rail Commission a year ago. I should say 2 years ago. And they are now just reconsidering whether or not they should continue in that. I hadn't heard from the county that they'd actually pulled out completely, but they are in the midst of fundraising for $100 million partnership that they have to provide to MnDOT and the Metropolitan Council for their bus rapid transit system that's going to be coming into Woodbury and Oakdale. And that is their current focus for transportation. So again, they see the TCMC as something that is going ahead and that doesn't require their support anymore, although there will be possibly a station in Washington County on that line as well. So I think from what I understand, their support for that commission is up in the air.
This is Mark again. I just wondered, Dave, do you feel Washington County would be willing to work with the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission at some point in the future? Or, I mean, hopefully that doesn't become a stumbling block, for our rail commission here to, work with Minnesota's, commissions. Obviously, Ramsey County Regional Rail Authority, would be a good partner to work with us, but obviously the more, entities we can have work with us is obviously a better step going forward.
Yeah, I think that the devil's in the details, obviously. It's how we present the rail commission to them and what our ongoing goals are. Obviously, we've seen heavy ridership forecasts on this line. Their planning commission in Washington County, because they focused on the I-94 commission, have sold the Gateway Commission report that showed that high ridership as a report that actually shows low ridership, because it didn't offer ridership savings or car trip reductions on the I-94 corridor, because it's just a little bit too far north. Even though we could have filled the trains, it wouldn't have affected I-94 in their mind for local commute traffic. And so we've got to overcome that misrepresentation in our first presentation to the commission, as well as just let them know the news of what's happening with the Rail Commission and the support from other public groups along the way. I'm hoping that will sell them on the project, and in any way, shape, or form, I don't think they'll be standing in our way, except for possible, debates about where to put a station and what part Washington County riders will have in the overall ridership. It's that part of their county is the second busiest and most developed, Grant Township and Stillwater. And we've always held that that's going to be a good station stop and good rider generator. So we just have to, get them to change their perception of that a little bit. And part of that is the planning department staff in the county as much as the commission, because the commission frankly hasn't had anything presented to them yet, one way or the other, specifically concerning this rail corridor.
Hey, Mark, I might just add to that too. Some of it might depend on the direction of the commission we're forming and the relationships with Minnesota, but it may ultimately have more involvement in the implementation and launching of the service than maybe the Great River Rail Commission does. Just the nature of what the expectations are, particularly if it's a local service, the commission would have a greater influence than a multi-state service. Well, it's still going to be multi-state, but a service from Chicago to the Twin Cities that's primarily sponsored by the DOTs. I don't know if that'll make a difference, but in terms of being involved and having to be part of it to make sure the right decisions are made, that would be a motivation for them to be there.
Sure. Mark, again here, I think one thing that from the All Aboard Minnesota standpoint, is that, with a lot of the, future addition of regional rail, passenger rail service into the Twin Cities, even though, Washington County and some of the other areas that aren't directly involved on the TCMC line or the current Empire Builder Route line, we sort of felt that keeping other counties or rail commission groups involved, even if it doesn't directly affect them, is important to the overall, future big planning picture. And so it's our hope, we realize that areas, down along Red Wing, Winona may not have as much of a vested interest in some things going on, in other parts of Minnesota or Wisconsin. But I guess we try to look at it more from a regional standpoint. And that's kind of our hope or expectation, that other commissions will, even if they're not totally active, would still stay engaged. So that's kind of from an advocacy standpoint from All Aboard Minnesota, we're kind of hoping that we can continue to keep interest, there at some point.
All right, any other questions?
This is Mark again. Sorry to, I had one other question. This doesn't really relate to our area, but in Milwaukee with the airport expansion project for the Hiawatha stop there, I don't know if Crystal, if you're still on, if you would have any updates or comments on current improvements being done with the Milwaukee Airport station stop.
I can answer that too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Crystal. Yeah.
No, I was just going to actually defer to you, Scott, because I was in more of a listening mode, to be honest with you. I thought our run was going to be on, basically we're at 60% design for that project. If you want to say more, Scott, I wasn't prepared to speak. So.
That's all right. And having talked to Ron and listened to his update at MIPRC, and we'll probably have him on here again in the near future to give some of those updates. But I didn't really talk at all about the improvements happening on the Hiawatha service. WSDOT and Illinois DOT are trying to do some things to improve the service, to increase frequencies. And there have been a few challenges because they need to work with Canadian Pacific to create the capacity improvements to have more frequencies. And they wanted to do some sidings and other things in Illinois, and they ran into some of the not in my backyard opposition in the Glenview area. And so they had to kind of step back and look at some other projects. But some of the projects that they already planned are going forward. So one of them, so first of all, if those of you that may not be familiar, there are 7 trains a day sponsored by Wisconsin and Illinois between Chicago and Milwaukee. And they stop at Glenview, Sturtevant, and the Milwaukee Airport. And at the Milwaukee Airport, they only have a platform on, there's a double track there. They only have a platform on the east track. So they have a project that's going to put in a new platform on the west track and elevators on both sides, which would allow trains to stop on either track. And that gives Canadian Pacific a lot more flexibility on running trains through there. That project is moving forward. It's funded. WSDOT got some federal funding for that. They have another project, I think the name is Muskego Yard, where right now all the freight trains go right through the Milwaukee Intermodal Station, but there actually are tracks that can bypass the station by going through Canadian Pacific's yard. And that's another project that is moving forward that has been funded and will reduce the freight congestion and make it possible for more frequencies. So they want to get to 10. There's still a lot of negotiations about even getting to 8 or 9 just because of the track and capacity improvements that need to be made. But that's some exciting things that are moving forward. The other thing I'll mention, as long as we're talking about Chicago and Milwaukee, an example of where WSDOT's already working on shuttle connections is that they did contract with Coach USA to run 2 buses a day between Milwaukee Intermodal Station, Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, Appleton, and Green Bay. And so you can actually buy a ticket from, say, Appleton or Green Bay to Chicago, and you transfer at Milwaukee Intermodal Station, and their direct connections to the Hiawatha service. You can also use them locally because there's been so much reduction in intercity bus service that it puts in an important frequency there. And those buses also go on to Mitchell Airport. So you could take one of those buses, say from Fond du Lac to the airport in Milwaukee. So they have been working on improvements. All of these things have been a little bit complicated by COVID over the last year, but full schedules are running again on those services. So if you ever want to get to Chicago and the Empire Builder doesn't work for you, you can drive to Milwaukee and get on at either downtown or the airport and take the train in.
If I could just add one thing about the Thruway to Green Bay, you know, when we were working with them to set that up, one of the things we found is a lot of the larger businesses were looking for connections to that service to bring, you know, various types of workers in. So as you're, you know, as you were going forward and developing that Thruway, that might be a topic of consideration, you know, to expand or to support in both directions.
All right. Thanks, Crystal. Appreciate your weighing in on those too. So, all right, I've got 8:58. So we probably have do one more question, or we can end just a couple of minutes early. All right, I do want to thank everybody for joining us again today. And again, our next meeting will be on Thursday, December 16th, and we'll be looking forward to giving you more information about one of the things we're working on. And I think it's worth saying that, you know, some of us who've been involved in this for a few years, given the passage of the bill, federal bill, and some of the ways the public is responding, I think we're on the cusp of some exciting times, and hopefully we can be working hard to be part of all that. So thanks everybody for being with us today, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, Mark.